Great. So, hello and welcome to Blueprint Cymru, a podcast bringing ideas, experience and ambition to the conversation of building a better future for Wales. My name is Simon Hobson. In today's episode, I'm joined by Adam Taylor. Adam is a passionate advocate for environmental action. He has stated that it's his mission to tackle the climate and nature crisis head on. As the youngest ever CEO of Wildlife Trust in Wales, an MBA graduate with distinction, and a driving force behind major projects in nature restoration and climate adaptation, Adam brings a wealth of experience across the charity, public and private sectors. He's led initiatives that reintroduced species, empowered young people, created green jobs, and developed nature-based solutions for enhancing both the natural world and communities. Adam currently serves on the board of Natural Resources Wales, advises through his consultancy Ad Infinitum, and holds key roles with Eden 7, the National Botanic Garden of Wales, and more. So welcome, Adam. Thank you for joining us.
No problem at all, Simon. Thanks for having me.
So perhaps you could tell the listener a little bit about who you are, childhood, where you grew up, and how you ended up heading into the career you've gone into.
Yeah, sure, no problem at all. So I was born in North London, but fairly early on, my family decided we should move out to a more kind of rural location. So we ended up in northeast Essex, in a little village. Well, it's a very large village called Tiptree, which is famous for its jam factory and its jam, which is those little tiny pots of jam that you'll see on hotels all around the world. So grew up surrounded by kind of fruit farms and small scale farming. And that was a really enjoyable and kind of idyllic childhood, cycling between villages on the Essex coast and, you know, enjoying time in the woodlands, heathlands and grasslands of that neck of the woods. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do at school, and my careers advisor was somewhat lackluster. So I said, "What do you like doing?" And I said, "I like playing sport." So they suggested I followed that. So I did a sports science degree at University of Essex, and luckily, because I went there, I was able to bring it back around and back to my love of kind of the outdoors and the countryside, write my dissertation on a topic called green exercise, which is kind of also thought of as social prescribing. So really, my dissertation was around the positive effects on the physical and mental well-being of exercising in natural spaces versus urban or indoor spaces. After that, I went to become a personal trainer in Harley Street in central London briefly. Didn't really enjoy that. Off the back of that, got to know some people and worked as a management consultant for a short while in central London, mainly for central government clients. So the MOD and DCLG and DWP and other acronyms, and despised that with passion. I kind of every day, it was funny, on like a Monday morning, I'd stand on the platform and everyone was wearing dark suits and, you know, looking at their feet and no one was talking. It was a bit like they were mourning the death of the weekend. It was all very maudlin. And then on my walk from the station to my office, there was like one dying street tree, which I kind of thought was a bit of a, you know, an analogy for how I felt in that role. So thankfully, when I was home one weekend, walking the dog, bumped into a wonderful lady, Joan Pinch, who was a warden for Essex Wildlife Trust. And they were doing some tree felling and some heathland restoration work on the heathland opposite my childhood home. And I kind of asked her what she was doing, got chatting with her. And then about 3 weeks later, I gave her my notice, volunteered full time for 2 years in various different environmental organisations, and then from there was very fortunate to be given lots of support and get jobs as a nature reserve warden, landscape scale conservationist, and then moved over to Gloucestershire as a head of land management for Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, and then latterly chief executive of Gwern Wildlife Trust in South East Wales. So I was very fortunate to have a lot of support and move into the sector and up through the sector quite quickly. So yeah, most of my career has been working with charities and in the environment sector, but as I say, done other work with the private and public sector, and nowadays do a lot of consultancy, in particular with the public sector and with charities still.
That sounds an interesting trajectory through a career. I understand when you joined Gwent Wildlife Trust, it was on the brink of bankruptcy. So how did you turn that around and bring it to sort of growth and be able to survive? And I guess I've got two questions in one, really. Is why do you think that was failing, and that it wasn't leadership there in the first place? Is this related to the brain drain that Wales sees?
It's an interesting question. So I think for so many charities, it's, obviously the third sector, the charity sector, exists in a space where it is a market failure. So there is not a profit motive. So there's no one, you don't get Apple or Google running nature reserves because obviously they don't make any money. And it goes beyond the basic requirements that government believe they need to provide for citizens. So charities are always slightly fraught because they're wrestling to try and deliver something that people don't quite value enough to vote for. And wouldn't necessarily pay enough for. So it's always a difficult position, and charities are always tending to kind of go between periods of stability and then difficulty. So when I joined, I think it had gone through a period of success a couple of years previous, but then possibly I had been taken off the ball a little bit because there had been some significant legacies left to the organisation, and because that money was there wasn't as much time and effort being spent on developing other income streams. So fundraising and earned income. So from providing products and services and things like a standard kind of private sector organisation would. So one of the big things that I did, which I think is always really important and often isn't well dealt with either in charities or the public sector, is actually kind of going back to strategy and saying, actually, what are we trying to achieve here? What resources and assets do we actually have to do that? And let's be realistic. Let's have open, honest conversations about what's working, what's not working, and also what we can actually do with the resources we've got. So, that was kind of really important, and just including everyone in those conversations, because it's very personal. People work in this sector and in these organisations because they care about the cause, and it can be very difficult to have conversations about things that shouldn't continue or about things that need to change, because it feels as if it's a personal failing when actually it isn't. Normally it's the sector or the organisation's moved on or the public's moved on, and the charity hasn't moved with it. In terms of difficulty around brain drain, as I said, I don't think it's a Welsh specific thing, and I don't think it's necessarily a charity thing either. I think it's common across all sectors. So I think it's important to remember kind of strategy is the child of scarcity. So basically, the reason why you have a strategy is because you can't do everything that you'd like to do. So you do need to have those, as I've said, kind of conversations about what you should or shouldn't do. And I always find that because those are difficult conversations, or because the analysis involved in understanding how much it's going to cost to deliver what you're hoping to deliver, or the risks that might be associated with delivering what you're hoping to deliver, because that work isn't done in the first instance, or because people know that if they were to do that work, they'd have to say no to a lot of stuff and cause a lot of kerfuffle during the strategy development phase. They defer that, but then they end up having these perpetual conversations week in and week out throughout the whole delivery period, basically telling members of the public why they can't do what they said they were going to do, and trying to manage overworked, overstretched staff, and trying to raise more funds to plug the financial holes that their plan already had in them. So I find you've got to have the difficult conversation earlier or later, and I prefer to have it earlier. So I think that's another way in which kind of I was a bit more happy to bite the bullet early on. So that was kind of how things played out there.
There's a couple of things there that come to me. One, which I think is potentially related to your dissertation, and we spoke on it in your introduction, and that is the monetary value of wildlife and green spaces. As I understand it from my limited reading around the subject, there are increasing number of studies that show having access to green spaces and hearing birdsong and so forth does help with particular challenges that the whole of the United Kingdom are facing, and particularly Wales, with mental health and physical health as well. And obviously that would take pressure off the NHS and those services. So I wonder why, and whether you've got any thoughts on why that isn't considered politically. And I guess there's also something that I'd quite like to explore with you is we see in North America, it's quite common to pay to access wild spaces, even if it's just a small amount. And that doesn't seem to ever be a conversation as far as national parks are concerned within the broader British Isles.
No, I think it's really interesting. So there's a couple of things. As you say, the evidence is profound that ultimately prevention is better than cure, and that access to green spaces, and in particular blue spaces, so spaces where there is water, and in particular running water, and the value of birdsong are all preventative in terms of a whole host of different health risks. And subjective well-being significantly increases as people spend more time in nature. So it is well known, but I think that health and well-being access through, for example, what's called green prescribing or social prescribing is still quite limited, because it's outside of the traditional approaches of the healthcare sector. A bit similar to, for example, nature-based solutions. So when you're talking about, I don't know, reducing flood risk, we're very happy to pour concrete and build big flood walls. But actually, if we were to put in some, literally kind of logs and sticks and branches into watercourses to slow the flow of water, or were to dig more ponds, or to restore floodplains, or plant trees alongside rivers, any of the above, they all equally slow the flow of water, reduce flooding, reduce drought, reduce wildfires. But again, you have to have a slightly different training and a different risk appetite, because, for example, giving someone a medication which has gone through a peer-reviewed trial is seen as being slightly more of a known quantity than having someone go out and enjoy green space. Equally, pouring concrete and having a reservoir that can store X number of million cubic litres of water is seen as a more known quantity and lower risk, therefore, than the nature-based solutions, despite the fact that in both instances, green prescribing and natural flood management, that they're both considerably cheaper and have multiple benefits. And that's where I think the valuation often doesn't take things into account. When you look at our economics, we very much don't factor in any externalities. So, we extract value from either the labour of the individual, or from the environment, or from intellectual property, or whatever. But we don't necessarily factor in the costs of that. So we don't factor in, that someone who's making the garments we're wearing might be earning less than a living wage in the country that they're making them, or that the amount of water it's taking to call some data center somewhere because of the AI queries I'm putting in is not factored into the cost of the query that I'm running. So I think there's that challenge as well, is we're very bad at looking at externalities, and therefore we're very bad at looking at the multiple benefits that nature-based solutions can provide.
It strikes me, that the history of health, if we look back 100, 150 years ago, even though it might have been to a more affluent part of society, it was quite normal to go off and be prescribed a session at the spa, or to go to the Swiss Alps, or something like that. And yet I know from my past, and from I've done a fair bit of work in the Balkans, and I know there that doctors still send people off to spend some time in the mountains, or go and walk by some lakes. So I wonder why there's that disconnect there now in society within the United Kingdom. Perhaps that's just an open question, but
it's a really interesting question, and I think, as you say, kind of access to the countryside. We have, although we have one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, all of the nations of the UK are. We do also have some of the greatest access, in terms of right to roam and our ability to access national parks and, and other kind of sites which are, as you say, free to access. In a way, we don't value them. We kind of see the UK as this green and pleasant land. And we all inherently know that this is what we're aiming for, because ultimately it's where everyone either retires to or moves to when they can. After they've often spent a bit of time in an urban setting, they almost instinctively end up moving back to a greener setting or having a garden or doing things outdoors because that's what they value. And I think that's something that we've kind of lost a little bit. It's almost engagement with others. So there's a social element, the community element, and engagement with the outdoors, which I think are both essential to rebuilding kind of society and seeing the value in these spaces. And as you say, whether it be the sheer abundance of parks that are in central London versus somewhere like New York City, you've got one large park, don't get me wrong, Central Park's massive, lovely, etc., but it doesn't actually serve the vast majority of people. In London, almost every other street in a city where, the land value is extortionately high, we still have these vast green spaces, which are the lungs of the city and the places we go to, to recharge our batteries. So it's, for a long time, forever really, been kind of known that these are essential to our well-being. But increasingly, as we become more digital focused, we've spent less and less time outdoors, and some of these things just can't be replaced. You can't replace time in nature with an app of any description.
So you, as I understand it, have been quite influential with your work with Natural Resources Wales, and were involved in the debate on creating the Clwydian Range and Dee Valley National Park. So, I mean, this is literally a pivotal moment in Welsh protected areas. So, how do you respond to those who say that Wales needs to go further with its environmental governance and it's too slow and unfit for the scale that, well, I guess, wildlife and habitat loss faces?
So I've got to give all of the credit to the fantastic team at NRW and kind of colleagues who had been doing the work. I'm very fortunate to be chair of the Protected Areas Committee. My predecessor, Dr. Rosie Plummer, had done a huge amount of work on that before I arrived, but I've been lucky to step into the position just as we're getting towards the end of the process, which is really exciting. And I think the statement of intent is really powerful, because we haven't had a new national park in Wales since 1957. There was a consultation, and it almost got to the point of being signed off that there would be a Cambrian Mountains National Park in the 70s. But then at the last minute, the political will wasn't there to support it. So, as I say, it's kind of getting on for 70 years since we've had a national park. But designation of a national park alone won't necessarily change a great deal. I think more significant as an indicator of how seriously Wales in particular takes nature conservation is the new, I won't give you the full name because it's too long, but effectively the Environment Targets Bill for Wales, which effectively will look at the way that we measure, monitor and manage environmental targets within Wales, and it will put it for the first time ever on an even footing with kind of net zero. So there will be legally binding targets for biodiversity to say, no, actually, we need to be achieving these. And that kind of comes in line with, and was probably driven to a degree by the coming Montreal framework, which effectively is this global treaties that countries have signed up to, nearly 200 countries, to try and designate and effectively manage 30% of land, sea and inshore waters by 2030. So it's kind of, we just refer to it as a 30 by 30 target. And that's been a big driver as well. And, you know, I think that's important, and that will help us clarify focus, because I think one of the things that's always been really beneficial about looking at net zero targets is that things are a little bit clearer and a little bit easier, because you've got a single number. You know, it's like, we've got to try and keep it below 1.5 degrees warming, or you know, we want to reach net zero by 2050. There are quite clear, obvious targets. With biodiversity, because you've got millions of species, it's very fractured as to how you might go about addressing that huge complicated problem. Whereas having a target, something like 30% of land and sea effectively managed and protected and effectively managed by 2030 is really easy for us all to get our heads around and to work together on.
But I wonder how one goes about communicating the success of that to the general public if you're not living and breathing conservation, but most people care about the environment, they care about climate change and wildlife, but they don't necessarily know how to quantify whether what you've just spoken about is succeeding. What work have you done on how you communicate that to people?
Science communication, especially in biodiversity, I think is very poor. I won't lie at all. It's not my area, but I have significant reservations and concerns that biodiversity loss is a bit like climate change, still a kind of wicked problem. We don't really have a known solution to this. And one of the challenges, as I've said, is because it's an underinvested in area and we're kind of firefighting a lot of the time, being reactive, it's very difficult to say, oh, this will work, because obviously talking about different species and different external factors and context factors, for example, the communities you're working with or the habitats you're working on or the climate of the area, just adds a number of different layers that mean it's not very easy to come up with a, how do I put it, a single kind of silver bullet, so to speak, that will solve the problem everywhere. So one of the challenges that we've had is firstly being able to demonstrate significant success, and then being clear about the fact that these are the interventions that we know work, and in other areas we need people to continue supporting the work and continue investing, despite the fact that we're still not turning the tide. Things are still continually declining in terms of biodiversity, and we do need to do even better. We've had millions of people over the last 100 years who have worked their socks off and done amazing work, and I'm not criticizing that at all, but it is that case of saying, actually, realistically, this isn't effective enough, so we need to be trialing new approaches, some of which won't work, in order to be able to find those which do. So I liken it a bit more to kind of the communication that you might have around research and development in, for example, the medical field, because people wouldn't say, oh, well, I won't give to a cancer charity because I haven't found a cure yet. So what's the point? My money would just go on, be wasted on all this science. And I think that in nature conservation, we've been a little bit concerned about communicating that there are a lot of questions, probably more, well, definitely more questions that still need to be answered than we have answered. And that therefore we're going to have to try different things, and we're going to have to report back on what works and what doesn't. The things that really do work are often either extremely targeted, so saving individual species or small groups of species by investing heavily in a limited number of sites or a small area, or as I say, almost selective breeding of species, be it plants, animals, whatever, and then introducing them or reintroducing them into the landscape, or often taking approaches which aren't really scalable or transferable. So, for example, where you've got large national parks which are effectively completely devoid of human life, and you go, yeah, but we've got to have people working and living in these landscapes. That's what makes them, part of the culture, in particular the British Isles. So we can't, denude the landscape of people or the professions and traditions they have. We've got to try and figure out how to get those things to work alongside each other. And I think that's, one of the big challenges still to come is taking people on that journey with us and collectively trying to find answers.
I was wondering that, because I come from a farming and gamekeeping family background, and there's often within those communities the initial reaction to a new national park being proposed or any form of change in protection to the landscape is, well, that's going to make it impossible for me to do my job, and actually I'm looking after the land. This is how generations of people like myself have looked after the land. So clearly it's important to communicate with them on the first instance, and how you're not putting their backs up to start with. But I was also curious as to, when so many people in Wales are facing, day-to-day cost of living challenges, and also we've seen quite a bit of flooding and so forth in recent years and months. How does one develop low-cost, nature-based solutions to solving those infrastructure problems that perhaps people are a bit more tuned into and want to be solved? That work with people and the landscape and go hand in hand with protecting and helping natural environment thrive. Have you thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So firstly, I think it's really important to say it's essential that you work with key stakeholders, and as you say, the main stakeholder in Wales is the farming community. Thankfully in Wales, from my perspective, my personal view, is that there are still large numbers of farmers who are farming smaller areas of land. So, where I grew up, it was very much that all of the land had effectively been bulldozed flat, all the hedgerows taken out, all the ditches filled in, and you had hundreds of acres of individual fields. And then, often farmers would be farming vast tracts of land. And it's not saying that farming didn't have a place, but it was very hard to try and figure out how to fit biodiversity into that landscape. In Wales, we're in a very different place, whereby I think, as well as food production, the natural resources that Wales has are much more, firstly, intact, and secondly, much more obvious and prevalent. And when I think about it and how to actually engage people actively who are living and working on the land, I always ask a simple question first when I'm talking to conservationists, which is, if it were your land, if it were your farm, and let's say you're a third, fourth, fifth generation farmer on that site, and you had to choose between either managing your land intensively but perfectly legally, or doing something that's nice for wildlife but that is not economically viable, which might mean that you can't pay the mortgage or you might not be able to pass the farm on to future generations, which would you do? And I think anyone who's being honest would say that they would do the first one, despite the fact that that wouldn't necessarily be particularly palatable. And I don't think it's particularly palatable to many farmers and landowners. The farmers and landowners I know, I've not ever, and I've met thousands, literally thousands, I've not ever met a farmer or landowner who does not care about the land or is not doing more than they have to do. But I think the conversations have to be had about, what do you need from this to make it work? And I think often there are these kind of high level solutions that are dreamt up and they're then dropped from a great height, and farmers can either take it or leave it. And I think that's problematic. And that kind of comes back to the challenges around, for example, agri-environment funding schemes, whereby you come up with a figure and you go, right, do you want £100 per hectare to do this, that, or the other intervention? And either it works or it doesn't. But often it's very hard. It's often quite marginal, and the farmer has to jump through a lot of hoops and do a lot of extra work that they're not used to in order to deliver something else, which may not be as lucrative if they have a good year for whatever crop they're currently farming. So I think it's actually going, okay, what support do you need to potentially have a more mixed farming approach, diversify your income so you can also lower your risk, to make sure that you can continue to look after and live on the land that you love for generations to come. And I don't think those conversations are being had enough, and I don't think that the support that's provided is long-term enough, and the assurances and insurances are long-term enough to allow people to do what they probably would like to do if they could genuinely take up those options. In terms of the second part of the question, so with nature-based solutions, one of the things I think is really interesting that's often not thought about is, when I think about farmers and landowners in the UK, especially in Wales, I often think it's really interesting, just from like an economics point of view, that of all of the things that can be produced on the land, be it traditional farming types, be it horticulture or livestock or dairy or or arable or a whole host of others, that we have pretty much as a society and as governments pushed farmers and landowners into producing commodities. And often those commodities are directly in competition and almost indistinguishable from the commodities that we can buy from other parts of the world, whereby people aren't expected to meet the same environmental standards or to pay their workers the same amount. And it's always surprised me that we don't think, okay, well, what is the unique strength that you have or your land has? What can we do to support you to be paid for that, as well as potentially producing, the food that you want to produce and maintaining the traditions around livestock and farming type? Because when I look at, farmers in Monmouthshire, for example, there are several farmers who have, specific areas of land, which would be absolutely essential in slowing the flow of water to avoid places like Usk and Monmouth from flooding. So as that is there, no one else in the world, no Brazilian, cattle rancher, no soybean farmer from, the US can compete with this particular farmer on this particular area of land to stop Monmouth and Usk from flooding. That's them and only them. So I'm very keen to actually go, what are the other ways that you can be paid? And that might mean taking some land out of production, but often those areas of land are also of lower productive value because they flood or because there are other issues. They're kind of the awkward corners, the river corridors and things like that. So I think it's really important to figure out how you can value land and pay people to manage land, or possibly not manage certain areas of land in certain ways to support their way of life and continue that for generations to come.
I think there's a sense in people that they inherently think those are great ideas and want to support them. But I think back to, I think it was in the 1990s, mid-90s, when the conversation really got going. If I remember correctly, there's an economist, Sean Rickard, someone of that similar name, who made the argument, who I think his argument largely has won out, that consumers are not interested in paying farmers for environmental schemes. Consumers want cheap food and they want it all year round, and they want to walk into a supermarket and get what they want to get. As slightly aside from your profession maybe, but do you think that mindset's changing in the consumer, particularly when there's pressures on paying for other things in the household?
I think there's greater awareness, and I think some people care more. However, people will always be driven by the necessities. So, when you look at kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and you think about what are their needs versus what are their wants, things like, supporting my local farmer to do something nice for the environment is well outside of my needs and into my wants. So I need to cover the costs of my needs first. Especially in the UK at the moment, most people are struggling to cover the costs of their needs. So we can't put it all on the consumer to say you have to do this, that, or the other. And I think there is therefore a place for government in particular around looking at some of these larger areas, because realistically, things like environmental degradation and moving towards net zero as an individual are quite costly. But collectively, our not acting starts to bear a cost for society that we can't bear, starts to create a cost that we can't bear. So there is that point about saying, no, as with green prescribing, social prescribing, we need to invest in the preventions better than cure. We probably need to borrow more money and spend more money at the initial stage in order to set up a system whereby we can start to avoid the future costs of these issues. So with things like natural flood management, we are looking at increasing issues around flooding and drought. Places like South Wales valleys, the highest rate of wildfires or, intentionally started wildfires in Europe. So you think, actually, we really need to look at addressing these issues. And you can address like a whole host of those, especially those problems, through things like restoring peatland. You can stop the emissions coming from degraded peatland, as well as slowing the flow of water, which also purifies it, which also reduces drought, which also reduces flooding, which also reduces wildfires. And that's not particularly expensive, but it's just something that actually you need someone to step up. And whether it be the government doing the work themselves or the government taking the steps to put in place the market-based mechanism. So it could be around regulation of saying you have to do X, Y, or Z. or, for example, looking at carbon offsets, which would have to, for companies above a certain size, post 2030, any carbon offsets should be bought from a Welsh-based market to restore native habitats, for example, and other areas as well where they've worked, not worked particularly well. There would be tweaks to be made, but things like biodiversity net gain in England could be significantly improved and implemented on new developments above a certain size in Wales. So there are all these kind of mechanisms that exist, but it does take a certain amount of political will, and that can be stacked onto those who are more able to pay initially. So, for example, the largest companies, while it's also being balanced against things like tax incentives, actually having more beneficial tax regimes for investing in certain, for example, nature-based solutions versus grey solutions. So there are ways that it can be done, but it does mean that we need to put the ethos and thinking behind the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act into practice, and starting to take the steps now, which will be costly in the short term, but will pay significant dividends in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And they will also be paying, they will be making sure that we do not incur costs that we can't afford to bear. So University College London's research has shown that it is a minimum of 6 times as much the cost to mitigate the effects of climate change once it has happened, as opposed to stopping or adapting to climate change in advance. We can't afford the cost now, really. So thinking, oh, well, when it's 6 times as high in probably 25 years' time, oh, we'll just pay it then. But we're not going to be able to. So it's going to take a lot of political will and action soon. And I'm optimistic, though not entirely convinced, that 2030 might be one of those eye-openers, because that's a point in time at which we've set a lot of targets around, movement towards net zero, biodiversity, and a whole host of other environmental targets. I would like to think that by 2030, when I would think without exception all of these targets will be missed, that we will take a very long, hard look at ourselves and go, actually, we need to be, ensuring that we have a sustainable future for ourselves and for future generations.
So leading on from that, then, do you think that as a society, I suppose, are we doing enough to equip people now, but particularly the next generation, with skills and understanding and how they make opportunities in their own lives that help lead to this climate, to the climate transition, but also to creating and being innovative in jobs and technology, and also I guess goes back to my earlier question about success in communications. Is the public sufficiently aware of how to have these conversations and why it's important to have conversations, particularly with parents or guardians with younger generations, and sort of creating that sense of understanding in society?
I don't think we're doing anywhere near enough to equip people. I'm an environmental professional, and I would still say that in terms of actually taking actions beyond my immediate sphere, I know very little. So in terms of, for example, the full gamut of different actions I can take around carbon reduction, I've done quite a few, but I'm sure there are dozens which I could do, which would be quite straightforward, that I just haven't thought of. And I think one of the issues is that because of, I don't know, the sorts of things that potentially make headlines and the way that information is communicated, there has been a lot of concern and anxiety raised around climate and biodiversity and plastic pollution and forever chemicals and a whole host of other things, effluent being pumped into our watercourses. I think what's not been done off the back of that, sadly, is informing people of, firstly, what they can do to stop that from happening. Secondly, what they themselves as individuals can do to mitigate it, to actually, resolve it. So I've always been an advocate of saying, okay, people are very climate anxious, but they're not very climate active. So how do we make them climate active? So actually communicating to people the different steps they can take in their, in their own home, in their gardens, in their local communities to start to address these issues. And in particular, trying to educate young people about the issues, but not so that they are scared, because fear doesn't tend to drive you to do the right things. It tends to, lead to despair and upset. But actually making people aware of the challenges around biodiversity loss, the challenges around climate, but also the solutions that they can implement themselves locally, and then linking them up with those decision makers or budget holders, so that they can start to propose, well, actually, in this area, why don't we have a constructed wetland so that we can, stop the effluent from that sewage treatment works ending up in the river? Or why don't we plant an orchard on this area of green space so that people can, take free food when they want to, and also maintain the genetic diversity of the apple and pear crops that we have locally. There's hundreds of little actions.
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking as well, you see the politicization of topics like net zero, and yet how many people really understand what net zero is, or and I think the politicians, I included that as well, both on both sides, people that say that it's an either or, like you either have net zero and no jobs and no growth, or you have the growth and we forget about the net zero. There doesn't seem to be that sensible debate around that, and I think that is imbued through the whole of the gamut of conversations around conservation and environment. So I don't know how we attack that in a positive way, so that people do feel that they're empowered to come back at people and have those conversations.
I think it's an interesting one, and I kind of come back to, I think initially, firstly, I think it's a false dichotomy. I don't think it's about being carbon emitting and rich, or net zero and poor, because ultimately, if we're carbon emitting, we potentially can extract some more value for a short period of time, and then we're going to have to invest considerably more than we ever extracted. Unless we had started, going kind of like Norway did with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, when they started to extract oil from the North Sea instead of giving everyone tax cuts like we did, then realistically you're never going to be able to build up enough of a buffer to be able to start to offset some of the issues. So I think it's a false dichotomy, and people need to be taking action immediately. But also, I do think there are many ways in which you can say, well, how about if we look at utilising existing budgets to deliver multiple benefits? So whether it be agri-environment schemes or flood funding, or funds currently assigned towards water quality, realistically, you could combine a whole host of existing budgets and say, well, if we look at planting of the area bordering watercourses on farms, with trees, we can be sequestering carbon whilst reducing the flow of nutrients into watercourses, whilst also reducing flooding and drought and a whole host of other things. So the budgets are there, but they're often only doing one job. And I think that's the difficulty, is because the budget holders and even the organisations are siloed. There aren't these conversations about, well, actually, how about if we pulled budgets and we had a greater impact? Because realistically, everyone's only got their own actions to deliver. But I'm hopeful, because we've got the environment targets bill coming through, if that lands, that will help to improve the governance across Wales, and mean that people are acting a little bit more collegiately, because we have got Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, we have got public service boards which bring everyone together, but people are still working in a fairly isolated, fairly traditional way, and people need to be looking more collaboratively and more future focused, and trying to almost kind of demonstrate servant leadership of understanding others' problems and figuring out how you can solve them before you lay out all of your problems and figure out how someone else is going to help you. And that does take it's a difficult conversation. It takes bravery, and it might mean that there are compromises that need to be made. But I do think that we do need to be working more, how do I put it, efficiently with these budgets, because at the moment, as I say, we haven't got enough money and we're not spending it that wisely. So there are certain areas, for example, around around investment in certain core infrastructure, which I know is probably less than a tenth of what it needs to be in order to make sure that people are climate proofed by 2050. And I'm thinking, actually, there are nature-based solutions that you can implement with the same amount of money.
And I think one of those areas that perhaps people are also less conscious of is the marine environment, and that's natural because we as humans don't spend a lot of time in it. But obviously, with the energy market changing, and in Wales and the offshore wind turbines particularly, and potential tidal projects, then that becomes an area that's increasingly needs looking after and thinking about. As I understand it, Wales already has 139 marine protected areas, which is approximately 69-70% of Welsh inshore waters and about 50% of all Welsh waters. So, but I guess there's then which we've touched upon with the farming, is how does that impact on, how do you get the balance right between protecting those marine areas and allowing those energy projects to develop and supporting traditional businesses and industries such as fishing?
I think it's an interesting question, and there is a difficulty around the fact that we need to be having a rapid transition to green energy production, whilst also trying to balance that against the precautionary principle of not doing things that we think might potentially be damaging until we have evidence that they're not. However, I think in instances like this, you have to move ahead, be constantly assessing things and constantly improving the approach. So I would imagine that the best practice around how to integrate offshore wind with biodiversity almost increases with every single development that takes place. But I think there has to be clearer communication of the findings and the lessons learned. Things didn't go well, with kind of an open, an openness and honesty, whereby there isn't blame cast on the developers or on the regulators for not having foreseen something which was, an unknown. And then for us to perpetually kind of, how do I put it, improve best practice. But I think the difficulty with that, firstly, is around the transparency and having a no blame culture, and secondly around the challenges that would potentially present around planning policy and how you would develop it almost as quickly as developments are going up. So I think these are are all challenges that can be grappled with. Thankfully, in the marine environment, a lot of the impacts are historic, so to speak, or are from kind of legacy industries or legacy approaches. So a lot of the challenges with everything from oil and gas terminals through to shipping and kind of coastal development are challenges that were not known about at the time and have been learnt about since, and where, especially at Natural Resources Wales, the team are working relentlessly with the companies who are involved in these industries or in charge of these different pieces of infrastructure to reduce the impact they're having. And in those areas, the slight tweaks that these organisations are able and willing to make have meant that we have started to see a kind of turning of the tide, excuse the pun, in terms of biodiversity loss. And it's very different from kind of land-based industries, whereby actually often you have to fundamentally change things, and also where you can take a much more hands-on management approach. With the sea, typically, apart from kind of the reintroduction of certain species and perhaps kind of the slight amendment of certain habitats, you are kind of removing the pressure and allowing it to restore itself. But as you say, the challenge, especially around the UK as a whole, Wales in particular, is that compared to the rest of Europe, Wales is seeing hotter marine heat waves, so we're seeing more issues with kind of the ocean temperatures rising, which is having a negative impact on everything from shell fisheries through to fisheries. And also we're seeing a lot of problems, or an increased rate of sea level rise around the UK as well. So actually, when we're looking at the models that were previously mapped about how fast is the sea level going to rise, and what are we going to have to do in terms of flood defences, and what's it going to mean for coastal communities, but also for coastal habitats. A lot of habitats, it doesn't sound important, but things like salt marsh and mud flats and seagrasses and things like that, and oyster beds are actually essential, firstly in terms of their biodiversity value and the habitat value, but also a bit like mangroves in like Southeast Asia, which we've all heard about. They actually reduce issues around flooding. They reduce pollution, and they help to remove a lot of the silt and pollutants and things from the watercourse. So there are a whole host of different kind of challenges we're going to face by the marine environment being hotter even than we had forecast, and the sea levels being higher even than we'd forecast. So that's kind of challenges that a lot of parts of Wales, in particular places like Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, are grappling with.
So for my final question then, I guess it's a two-pronged question, and I guess what gives you hope about Wales's ecology and its the future of its environment, and also sort of where within that sphere, where do you see Wales in the next 15 to 20 years? What do you see it achieving ideally?
Yep, no, great question. So I'm kind of, the reason why I kind of love and work in Wales is because I think the people of Wales genuinely give me hope. Because they value the culture, the history, the landscape, and the heritage, and they tend to come together for the good of the community. So it's about a collective kind of force for good in Wales, as opposed to kind of an individualistic approach. And I think that when we're looking at progressive policies and progressive discussions, we've had everything from the Chartists through, Anara and Bevan, and now the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So things are moving in the right direction, and Wales is happy to go its own way when it has an idea and support from the people to do something in a uniquely Welsh way. So that's one of the things that always gives me hope. Also, I think that Wales is, in terms of population, outlook, size, it's large enough that you can do exciting things, and it's a close-knit enough community that you can often talk to key decision makers and stakeholders without it becoming, too diffuse and too challenging. In terms of where I see Wales in the next 15 years, I'd say I think Wales is going to become increasingly important for its natural resources. So I think it's going to buck the trend faster than other countries in terms of biodiversity restoration, and also it's going to become increasingly important and valued in the UK for its water resources. I think it's going to invest heavily in kind of looking at new technologies and green infrastructure and digital as well. I'd like to think that it will see that because we're suffering kind of increasing costs around health inequalities, having the oldest population and, by self-identification, one of the populations with the highest degree of disability, that Wales will also move towards more of a kind of preventative healthcare model and more kind of care in the community. And I see hopefully Wales having more devolved powers and possibly having more more frequent conversations about the idea of independence and where Wales might want to go its own way in the future. So I think Wales has got a bright and exciting future. And the other thing I will say, because I kind of think this is ever present, is in 15 years I think that Wales will probably be above its 1 million target for number of Welsh speakers, more than a decade in advance of where it said it would be, because around Welsh language, I've seen a huge uplift and pride and drive. And I think that's something that's a really important kind of case study to shine the light on when you say, well, how could we engage the community around taking action for climate, nature, rural communities? Well, we've been able to do it with Wellbeing Future Generations Act, been able to do it with Welsh language. Why can't we do it with, the landscapes and the natural environment that we love?
That's great. Thank you for those positive thoughts. So what are your activities for the foreseeable months? Have you anything specific happening, any books coming out or anything of that nature?
So yeah, I nearly mentioned it earlier, but I thought I'd leave it, which was recently I've contributed to a fantastic book by Joe Harkness. So he wrote the book Bird Therapy, and his new book is Neurodivergent by Nature, Why Biodiversity Needs Neurodiversity, which I'd strongly recommend for anyone who is interested in or involved in environmentalism in any form, because it really does kind of tell these personal stories about how people are using their neurodiversity, similar to biodiversity, to help flesh out this kind of ecosystem and all contribute new ideas and unique skills and strengths to make sure that collectively we can have a bigger impact. So I'd recommend people get a copy of Neurodivergent by Nature. And in terms of other things, if people want to get in touch with me, then they can find me on LinkedIn. Just search Adam Taylor MBA, and on there as well you'll see kind of some information about my consultancy, Ad Infinitum, where I specialise in doing work around strategy, operational efficiency and change management, as well as coaching senior leaders, particularly in the charity sector. So if anyone wants to have a free conversation about any of those things and discuss some ideas, or or raise any potential questions, then please get in touch with me via LinkedIn.
Adam Taylor, Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for being today's guest. If you enjoyed this conversation, would like to contribute your knowledge to better Wales's future, or to participate in a future episode of Blueprint Cymru, head over to New Wales website, which is new.wales.